Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathsala. I am Dr. Harin Ramsiari from University of Delhi, Department of Zoology, Kirodimal College. Today we are going to be discuss about module community characteristic, type of biodiversity and diversity index, abundance, species richness, vertical and horizontal stratification part first, where I am especially discuss about community structures and community stability from the paper Principle of Ecology. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the basic structure of community, dis- describe the different type of communities, illustrate the classification and naming of the communities, the common characteristic of community. While walking in a forest, we not only see the different type of plant, trees like pine tree or maple tree, but also get glimpse of deer or squirrel or spider, sometimes indicating a collection of different kind of species contributing population different in the natural area surrounding uniform environment. These different populations are adapt to same environment and influence to each other through their association, either a positive or negative, and thus shaping or forming a biotic community. Different type of population in a given habitat are studied under the community ecology. Same kind of species constitute population, but when different populations, different kind of species interact together with beneficial and mutual adjustments sharing the same environment and habitat, the association is called community. Example of community include grassland, a pond or forest where the different animal organism population interacts with plants, another population in a natural area and sharing environment. Thus, community includes only the interacting biotic communities of ecology, that is living organisms. If we considered abiotic component, especially environment, associated with the biotic community component, different organisms, then it will be called ecosystem. Ecosystem and community vary on the basis of environmental factor. This figure represents a forest community depicting the different interacting population. Type of community: the interactions, association, and assembly of different populations shape the structure, diversity, natures, and dominance properties of biotic community. These interactions can be direct or indirect, or can be negative or positive, competition, predation, mutualism, and so on. Community has different meanings. Some say it's an assemblance of organisms of some kind habituing some area such as birds and grassland or lizards in desert as etc. Some ecologists describe it as a group of specialized organisms occupying same habitat like in the forest canopy, insect feeding, insectivorous birds form a community. Some ecologists refer to a term guild or ecological guild. In a specific habitat, the species groups sharing same property of feeding or foraging are termed as guild. For example, granivorous, insectivorous birds. In all the above the described definitions, the community is restricted to habitat sharing assembly of interest species. Major community is a large community which is an independent unit, self-sustaining and self-regulating and comprised of different minor communities. A forest, pond, desert, meadow, lake and grassland are some common example of major communities. Several minor communities form a major community. These small communities that form the self-sustaining major communities are not self-sustaining in it, rather for its existence depends on other type of communities. A typical example of major community is a forest the comprised of several minor communities such as animal community, all the interacting animal population in the forest, plant community, forest plant population, and the microbial community including fungi and bacteria population. A community can be autotrophic, self-sustaining, or heterotrophic. An autotrophic community gains solar energy through plants' photosynthesis. It forms a major community. Heterotrophic community depends on the organic materials which are fixed energy from outside. This figure represents alpine headlands autotrophic plant community Australia. Different minor communities such as heterotrophic micro-communities assembled to form major communities. For example, Fallen logs consist of different populations such as termite species constituting one population, bacteria and fungi or other small populations of different species together forming small micro-communities. Different species of population have overlapping terrestrial ranges where they coexist in a particular limited area representing a community. A community is composed of both plant and animals as their interaction is must for the survival of community. Under the similar environmental conditions, similar type of species found in a communities which tends to overlap each other and because of several variations and other variations animals may be shuffled between communities. Just like population has certain group characteristics not applicable on single organisms, similarly community also have a characteristic different than other their constituent populations. Either it's an aquatic or terrestrial community, both share an analogous biological structure. The biological structure comprised of an autotrophic component and a heterotrophic component. The autotrophic entities prepared food from inorganic substance and fix the solar energy, whereas the heterotrophic components are dependent on the store food of autotrophs. Heterotrophs utilize store food of autotrophs and through different mechanisms such as herbivory, carnivory, and decomposition are able to circulate and transfer the energy and nutrient in the ecological community or ecosystem. The physical structure of community make it easier to recognize and distinguish them from other community. The, the pattern of septal allocation of species and population within the community define its physical structure. The communities not only differ from other type of communities in the physical structure, rather pronounced different are there among communities of similar type. For instance, various aquatic communities appear different such as river, pond, ocean, lake, stream, etc. And also various terrestrial community appear distinct from each other such as desert, forest, grasslands, etc. The aquatic community vary with respect to flow and depth of water such as spring, pond, stream, lake and in salinity conditions such as freshwater, brackish and marine. Physiognomy, form and structure of terrestrial communities are measured by the prevailing life forms or growth forms of plant in a given area which are in turn depends on the substrate, climate a- and other characteristic of the habitat. Slide number 15, classification and naming of communities. Like any other biological units, communities can be described, studied and compared with other communities of different habitats or regions based on their classification system. Several approaches are used for community classification, each appropriate and each random to a specific viewpoint and need. The pronounced and easily recognizable features of ecological community is the physiognomy or gross structure of that community, and thus the community is named and classified based on the dominant life forms or species such as oyster bead or coral reef community, deciduous or coniferous forests as a community, tall or short grass prairie community. This type of approach is significant in classifying the communities with more than one type of dominant life forms or species group, such as sand, scale deserts, and sage brush desert communities that stays prominent at all times. Said scale grow better in those areas of deserts where mineral salt rich soil is present, and in drier areas where the brushes grow well in relatively high precipitation areas where soil is more permeable, deep, and relatively saline free. This type of classification does not work appropriately in those type of communities where species composition vary continually and seasonally, such as in plankton type communities, and when there is a difficulty in the determining the dominance within the community. Those communities which have sharply defined boundaries of the habitat are often regarded as associations or distinct natural units. These communities can be classified on the basis of physical appearance of habitat like sand dumps, streams, tidal mud, flats, ponds. However, mostly one community type units into another type of community and make it is difficult to determine the boundaries of the communities. Within a community, the species are associated to each other in a flexible and unique manner. Generally, species do not form collective groups of associates which are bounded to occur together. Those species are often found together and are confined to certain habitats which are shared and adapt to a specific set of environmental surroundings. However, those species which can be endure broad range of environmental surroundings are part of many associations and can and are not confined, rather occur over wide areas or habitats. Certain changes in the moisture, temperature, altitude, and other physical conditions causes species shift in dominance and abundance. This shifting of environmental gradient from one extreme condition to other causes gradual changes in the complexity and composition of communities, resulting into a sequence of communities where each community blends into successive community. This environmental gradient, when set an order of communities, it is referred to as continuum. Along the continuum, the different type of individual communities does not have any well-defined boundaries. Thus, same statistical criteria such as similarity, coefficient, frequency, distribution, etc. are used by the ecologists to sequence these communities along the environmental gradients. Along the environmental gradient defined continuum, the communities are statically oriented and called as ordination. Various statistical ordination techniques are used by the ecologists to classify plant communities. Another important approach which can be used for the classification of communities is dependent on the species composition, more prominently on fidelity, constancy, dominance, and diagnostic species. In 1962, Victor and Mueller Domboises and Ellenberg 1974 suggested that communities can be grouped into associations, alliances, orders, and classes. Such classification is based on the fidelity characteristic of species, defined as species faithfulness toward the community type. Species with high fidelity occur in few communities types, whereas low fidelity species occupy number of different communities. Classification can be possible on the basis of constancy of species. The higher the proportion of constant species within the community, that community can de- delineated more sharply and more homogeneous. Species can be grouped as ubiquitous, characteristic, or exclusive based on its affinity to community. Those species which are nearly or completely restricted to one type of community are grouped as exclusive. Species most closely recognized with certain community are grouped as characteristic, and species which are not restricted to any community type or without any particular affinity towards any type of community are grouped as ubiquitous. The species grouped as a dominance, high constancy, and characteristic are those species which are determine the type of community. H. A. Gilson proposed that in association of organisms, these organisms live together due to their adaptation potential to the particular limitations of the environment. The natural ecological communities with distinct boundaries or the ecological unit termed as closed communities. Ecotones are the edges of such communities where one type of habitat is replaced by other type, and along this gradient the species of this region also varies and show high diversity. The species at this region have broad ranges of occurrence, broad enough to overlap. Gilson suggested another type of communities called as open community, defined as the organization of co-occurring and independently distributed species within a particular association. Open communities do not have sharp boundaries and offer arbitrary limits with respect to ecological and geographical distributions of species. Community stability. Species interactions are complex. Species adapt to the prevailing conditions in the community and to one another and form niche and guilds. The growth and development of more complex community structure offer the coexistence of greater number of species. Thus, adapted species and complex structure of community signifies greater species richness. Under the environmental stresses, disasters, and disturbances, the community remain stable, attributing to the buffering action provided by complexity and species richness of the community. In 1998, Bendinu suggested four concepts based on which the stability of ecological systems can be explained, namely resilience, pers- persistence, resistance, and variability. The frequency of change of state variable defined the variability of the system, which is small for stable ecological system. When command factor acts against the system, the resistance of the system is defined as the amplitude of the modification of state variables. State system offer small resistance. When command factor act against the system, the duration of the equilibrium state provide the measurement for the persistence. The stable system has greater persistence. When command factor act against the system, the speed with which the state variable returns to the equilibrium is called as resilience. The stable system offer greater resilience. The command factors are the different type of disturbances and the system could be any ecological system. Equilibrium community. There are two ways to view community equilibrium: resistance and resilience. On occurrence of any kind of disturbance, the ecological system deviates from the equilibrium state, and the degree to which it changes is measured by resistance, defined as the ability of this system to resist variations. Communities with characteristically large biotic structure are most resistant to variations. Forest communities are relatively resistant by utilizing the stored reserve of energy and nutrients. The forest communities can withstand the disturbances such as drought, sharp temperature, and insect outbreaks. Resilience is the inverse of resistance. Following disturbances, the speed of bringing back to the system to its original equilibrium state is called as resilience. High resilience means rapid speed of attending back to the equilibrium state. Slow return indicates low resilience. Some ecological systems have the high resistance but low resilience, where some indicates little resistance and high resilience. Holling 1973-1984 proposed an equilibrium theory stating that ecosystem has a tendency called stability which allow it to reach and maintain an equilibrium state, steady or stable oscillations. Non-equilibrium community. Most ecologists believe that the ecological communities seldom attain equilibrium in nature. Opposing the equilibrium theory, Connell 1978 suggested that environmental disturbances allow the ecological community to stay at some level of non-equilibrium. In 1979, Hudson suggested that disturbances results into high diversity. In 1978, Connell proposed the intermediate disturbances hypothesis, stating that the intermediate levels of disturbances maintain high diversity in the non-equilibrium communities. This figure represents model for the concept of intermediate disturbances hypothesis. When the size of disturbances is large or small, the diversity offered is low, while at the intermediate size of disturbances the diversity is high. Similarly, very high or very low frequencies of disturbances in the ecological communities maintain low diversity, whereas intermediate disturbances can maintain high diversity. Characteristic of community. All the communities are governed by similar forces for their maintenance and share common and certain general characteristics. Instead of being sharply defined by the boundaries, these communities tend to overlap on each other, thus forming a gradient. Seasonal variations and other type of variations or disturbances causes frequent shifting of the animals between the communities. Communities are broadly separated but similar type of animals are found in the communities with similar kind of prevailing environmental factors. Some of common characteristics shared by all the ecological communities are given below. Stratification, vertical zonation, horizontal stratification. Ecotone, denser population in ecotone than both communities. It is also called as tensional zone. In comparison to the adjacent communities, the ecotone population has higher density with more species, and this rule is called as principle of edges. Species diversity, species abundance, ecological dominance, diurnal and seasonal variations. Other characteristics: pattern diversity, periodicity, turnover, interdependence, successional sequence. The structure and characteristic of community are briefly described in the third module of this chapter. So students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. A population is a group of interacting and interbreeding species of similar kind, and when different population of different kind of species interact to each other in a given habitat, it is called ecological community. These different species interact for the beneficial and mutual adjustments in a habitat and adapts to the similar environmental surroundings. Unlike ecosystem, which includes the interaction between abiotic and biotic component of ecology, the community includes only interacting biotic components, that is living organisms, plant, animals and microbes. The interaction, association and assembly of different populations shape the structure, diversity, niches and dominance property of biotic community that can be direct or indirect or can be negative or positive. Competition, predation, mutualism and so on. In a specific habitat, the species group sharing the same property of feeding or foraging we termed as guild. Major community is a large community which is an independent unit, self-sustaining and self-regulating and comprised of different minor communities. Several minor communities form a major community. These small or minor communities are not self-sustaining, rather for its existence depends on other type of communities. A community can be autotrophic, self-sustaining or heterotrophic. An autotrophic community gains solar energy through plant photosynthesis. It forms a major community. Heterotrophic community depends on organic materials which fix energy from outside. Either it's an aquatic or terrestrial community, both share analogous biological structure. The biological structure comprised of autotrophic component and a heterotrophic component. The pattern of septal allocation of species and population within the community define its physical structure. Physiognomy, form and structure of terrestrial community are measured by the prevailing life forms or growth forms of plant in a given area, which are in turn depends on the substrate, climate and other characteristics of the habitat. Several approaches are used for community classification, each appropriate and each random to a specific viewpoint and need. The pronounced and easily recognizable feature of ecological community in the physiognomy or gross structure of the dead community, and thus the community is named and classified based on the dominant life form or species. Those communities which have sharply defined boundaries of the habitat are often regarded as associations or distinct natural units. However, mostly one community type units into another type of community and make it's difficult to determine the boundaries of communities. Those species are often found together and are confined to certain habitats which share and adapt to a specific set of environmental surroundings. Certain changes in the moisture, temperature, altitude and other physical conditions causes species shift in dominance and abundance. This setting of environmental gradient from one extreme condition to other causes gradual changes in the complexity and composition of communities, resulting into a sequence of communities where each community blends into successive community. This environmental gradient which set an order of communities, it is referred to as continuum. Along the environmental gradient defined continuum, the communities are statically oriented and called as ordination. Those species which are nearly or completely restricted to one type of community are grouped as exclusive. Species most closely recognized with certain community are grouped as characteristic, and species which are not restricted to any community type or without any particular affinity towards any type of community are grouped as ubiquitous. Under environmental stress, disasters, and disturbances, the community remains stable, attributing to the buffering action provided by complexity and species richness of the community. In 1998, Vedano suggested four concepts based on which the stability of ecological system can be explained, namely resilience, persistence, resistance, and variability. The natural ecological communities with distinct boundaries are the ecological units termed as closed communities. Open community are defined as the organization of co-occurring and independently distributed species within a particular association. On communities do not have sharp boundaries and offer attributary limits with respect to ecological and geographical distributions of species. There are two ways to view community equilibrium: resistance and resilience. Resistance is defined as the ability of this system to resist variation. Resilience is inverse of resistance. Following disturbance, the speed of bearing back the system to its original equilibrium state is called as resilience. Holling 1973-1984 proposed an equilibrium theory stating that ecosystem has a tendency called stability which allows it to reach and maintain an equilibrium state, steady or stable oscillations. In 1978, Connell proposed the intermediate disturbances hypothesis, stating that the intermediate level of disturbances maintain highest diversity in the non-equilibrium communities. Communities are broadly separated, but small similar type of animals are found in the communities with similar kind of prevailing environmental factors. Some of common characteristics shared by all the ecological communities are stratification, species diversity, species richness, dominance, relative abundance, ecotone, edge effects, pattern of diversity, periodicity, succession, sequence, and tropic interaction. Thus, community is a complex that is formed of different interacting species, and its characteristics are dependent on the physical and biological factors. Thank you.